Should I start? Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Walter. Joining me are Professor Jesse Driscoll, Professor Steph Haggard, and one of our second-year students, Nic Zinter. It's really wonderful to be here. Thanks for sharing this hour with us. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have 20 minutes for questions. So as you're listening to all the things we say, some of which will be reasonable and some of which I'm sure will not be reasonable, start typing away. We're going to be collecting your questions and we're happy to answer them at the end of the 40 minutes. So let me quickly introduce everybody in case you don't know them. I'm going to start with Steph Haggard. For those of you who don't know Steph, he would be too humble to say this, but he is one of the world's leading experts on democracy, on transitions to democracy. His most recent book is called Dictators and Democrats, and it looks at a phenomenon that we've seen over the last 18 years, where we've seen a wave of countries becoming more democratic. And we've seen variation in what's happened to those countries. Some of them have stabilized and they've retained the democratic features that they've put in place. Yay, yay, that's a good thing. But some of them have not, and they've moved back towards authoritarianism. And the book that he wrote with his partner, Robert Kaufman, tries to explain why we have some successful cases and why others were not successful. And of course, this is very pertinent to what we're seeing around the world today. I think all of us sort of have this expectation that once countries become full democracies or relatively mature democracies, they stay there. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of democratic backsliding around the world. And we're going to talk about how that may or may not play into the outbreak of political violence and civil wars. So having Steph here is a huge treat for me. It's a huge treat for you guys, and we're going to have some fun with it. Then, of course, we have Jesse Driscoll, and Jesse's one of the foremost experts on countries that unexpectedly collapse. And they collapse into violence that tends to be perpetrated by lots of small militias. And again, this is very pertinent to what's happening today because we're starting to see a different type of civil war emerging. These are not civil wars with large conventional armies in the field. We're starting to see civil wars that are being fought by lots of armed factions and lots of militias. And then, of course, when you think about that in terms of what's happening in the United States today, one of the things that we do know is that the number of militias here in the United States, armed militias, have doubled in number since 2008. We are at about 500 armed militias. The militias that used to be in the United States, the small number of them used to be left-leaning, so you could think about environmental organizations, the Weathermen, exactly. Since 2008, and of course, that did coincide with the emergence of our first African-American president, most of the militias are now right-wing, and many of them are anti-government. There's a whole really interesting discussion to be had about that. It turns out one of the best ways that you can identify and join these groups is via social media, and in particular Facebook. So that's a phenomenon that's happening here in the United States, and Jesse is one of the world's experts on that, and so he can speak to that. And then we have Nic Zinter. He is our student, and he's going to keep us honest, and he's going to basically tell us what he thinks normal people who don't have their heads in clouds and live in an ivory tower, what normal people would really want to know, and he's going to add his particular expertise. Nic is in the international politics track. His area focus is Southeast Asia, and he knows a fair amount about conflict and ethnic conflict, especially in places like Burma. So he's going to add a whole other perspective and regional expertise. So that's my introduction. I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to ask my very esteemed panelist. The question that's driving this panel, which is the U.S. headed to a second civil war?
Well, let me start because I'm going to throw it back on Barb. When you first asked me this question, I thought this was crazy, and then I thought, well, but it's Barb Walter, so it can't be completely crazy. But let me actually throw it back on you in the following way. So, if you look at countries and try to figure out what the risk factors are for civil war, what would sort of top your list? Because if we had that list, then we could think about whether the U.S. checks any of those boxes.
So I actually have a fairly good, concise answer to that. I'm involved in this group called the Political Instability Task Force, and one of our jobs is to try to come up with predictive models for where political violence is likely to emerge. And it turns out that two of the best predictors of whether a country will experience both political instability, but they also include armed conflict, going all the way up to civil war, is whether a country is moving towards or away from democracy. It used to be that we just thought that civil wars broke out as countries were moving from authoritarianism to democracy, but now we're seeing that they tend to break out when it's going in the opposite direction, and it tends to break out a little differently as countries move up the democratic ladder. It takes a while for armed conflict to break out. If they're moving down the democratic ladder, it tends to be relatively rapid. Also, when countries are moving up the democratic ladder and experience war, oftentimes it starts as a military coup. That's not the case in the opposite direction. It tends to occur out of the formation of militias or as a result of large-scale demonstrations that turn violent. Now, having said that, countries that find themselves in this middle zone between autocracy and democracy, most of them don't experience civil war. So it's not like you get into that pseudo-democratic or pseudo-autocratic zone and you have violence. The ones that do tend to have a second characteristic in common, and this is what worries me about the United States, they also tend to be polarized along ethnic, religious, class lines. So the population is polarized along some identifying line. So I've been asked over the last 2 years, probably 100 times, do you think a civil war could happen in the United States again? And I would say up until 2 years ago, I would say absolutely not. It's a silly question. It's a question designed to, be provocative, and I didn't engage with it. And I don't feel that way anymore. And I do think a number of things have happened in the last 2 years. We know, for example, that the United States has become less democratic. We have seen all the things that the Trump administration has tried to do to sort of whittle away at rights and freedoms and the rule of law. And in fact, if you go to the major data set we have that classifies countries, the scale goes from -10 to +10. All of the liberal democracies that people point to as being exemplars of democracy, Australia, Canada, Switzerland, Sweden, UK, all of those countries are +10. That's where the United States was for a very long period of time. It has been downgraded since 2016 to a +8. We are now in the company of Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and South Africa. So that's something to be cognizant about. And then if you sort of think about polarization, it's clearly something It's a tool that's being used by politicians to try to divide the American population. Um, we know that it can be an effective tool. It's what Milosevic did in the months leading up to the war in the former Yugoslavia, where he actively basically utilized fear-mongering to convince Serbs to back him. And it was quite effective. And you see elements of that in terms of what President Trump has done to try to divide the American population along racial lines. And again, if you were to go to the data, in 1994, less than 20% of both Republican and Democratic Party members viewed the other side unfavorably. That was the question. Do you have unfavorable view of them? It was less than 20%. Today, it's over 40% of Americans in both parties. So polarization is clearly increasing. And then when you get to violence, that is also increasing in a number of different ways. And we can point to all of the mass shootings that have occurred in every part of the country. We can look at if you want to call them, attempts at targeted assassination of Trump supporters, but it's happened also on the other side. If you remember the Republican baseball team, where you had a mass shooting targeting members of Congress who were playing that game. So you're seeing both mass shootings, some of which appear to be politically motivated. You see bombs being sent through the mail, and you see targeted assassinations. And then when you look more generally, here's a few data points. The U.S. was recently placed on the list of what's called most worsened countries for political stability by the Fund for Peace. That's a nonprofit dedicated to preventing violent conflict. It's also dropped more than any other country in the world on the Global Peace Index. That's an index that measures the relative likelihood of peace in countries. It declined. The U.S. declined 11 places to rank now 114 out of 163 countries for their measure of peacefulness. So
Barb and Jesse, let me ask you a question. So, why does polarization cross over into violence? I mean, that's really the question. So, yeah. and there is a very interesting little model that a guy named Milan Svolik has written, which is very intuitive, and I want to get your reaction to it. What he says is that when political parties become extremely polarized, I'm willing to tolerate bad behavior on the part of my guy because the alternative is so bad. And so it's not that I favor what he or she may do, but I just know it's better than the alternative.
Yeah.
Is that sort of what would push people into violence, some dynamic like that?
I think it's plausible. I mean, don't you? Doesn't that, like most good formal models, sort of have the smell of deep truth to you?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's that tolerance. And I think the thing that worries me is not so much just the crossover into violence, but also this idea of majoritarian politics, which is, rather than thinking about democracy as one where rights are being protected, if you win, you win.
Yeah.
And if you win, you exploit that advantage because you don't know what will happen if your opponent gets in.
Yeah.
And that dynamic of fundamental lack of trust about what happens when your opponent is in office, I think that can be a driver of violence and mobilization.
It can, but I don't know. It may also be the case that that's just part and parcel of what brass knuckle politics has always been. I mean, I have many of the same concerns that you do, Barbara. I'm afraid that I'm still kind of in the position that you were in 3 years ago, which is to say that, you know, despite being really discouraged day to day about kind of trends in our country, and of course I could go on about that, I still think that outbreak of civil war is just very low probability. And, my overwhelming feeling is that we have a really, really high stakes zero-sum politics playing out that you can see in the Supreme Court, and you can see that people will hold their nose and vote for a candidate they don't like very much because they're
better than alternative.
yeah, and so that that model really does have the smell of truth to me in terms of how a lot of people act at the ballot box because they worried about what a Supreme Court would be like if the other side was in charge, because you're locking in people for generations. But that is a kind of a tactical decision that is made, I think, every 4 years in this country by a lot of people, and has been in the past. People have understood the same problem in the same way for quite some time. I think there maybe is some existential angst that is being felt by the current generation of white men in this country, and they worry about their privilege slipping away. But I wonder, and I'm living through that, I don't have the comparative knowledge of what it was like 50 years ago or 100 years ago, but my hunch is that you would have had a lot of polarization at different times in our system, and I just, having not lived through it, don't have anything to compare it to. So I have to take when people like you say you've never seen it this bad, then I take that very seriously, but it's not a life experience that I have.
Well, maybe we should take apart the concept of civil war, because you guys have worked on that. I get the sense that you mean something that may be short of secession. So let's just go back to the basics. I mean, the U.S. government has the capacity to govern the territory. I mean, this is a hard state in that sense. And we know that civil wars are more likely to break out where the government can't control parts of the territory. So maybe that isn't the problem. But it sounds like by civil war, you might mean something like an increase in decentralized violence, violence that's not maybe organized, so what might drive that process?
So, I mean, we are definitely seeing that type of, I'll put it in quotes, civil war emerging, where you have these armed militias. They're more of an urban phenomenon than a rural phenomenon. So they're moving into, they're
suburban.
Suburban, yes.
I think of the Bundys.
It's a useful distinction.
Yes. I think of the Bundys or Branch Davidians or these
zero casualties, right? I mean, it's like one of the most successful cases of counterinsurgency in human history, as far as I can tell.
But quite militant claims. I mean, people with long-range rifles, camped out on overpass.
Yeah.
But to the credit of the security forces of this country, successfully contained and then publicly humiliated, and eventually everyone stood down.
Right. Well, but that's my instinct, is that it's well-governed territory.
Yeah, and I really don't know how it would happen, but if you look at these 500 known militia groups, they're well stocked. They're training for warfare, for defense. They have a very clear motivation and objective. They're going to fight against what they call government overreach. And of course, that could be interpreted in lots of different ways. It could be that a president comes to power whom they disagree with, and then basically begins enacting laws that they disagree with. So that's how I see it happening here. I think it's a low probability event as well. I don't think it's zero. And you do have a subset of the population that is deeply aggrieved and is stockpiling the weapons, and I think is going to be very difficult to, negotiate with, right? So what are the concessions you can offer these groups to keep them at peace?
I wholeheartedly concur with everything that you just said, and I actually want to follow up on, if you don't mind, on the point about it's not about Slovik's model, although it's consistent with it. Your point about the weatherman before. To get into kind of a formal problematic, there's something that we should talk about here. I think the typical problematic that we use to think about democratization, which you've criticized in your work, is that you have essentially calls for redistribution from the revolutionary left that is backed by credible violence. And so you essentially democratize in order to lock in a set of institutional bargains that actually give power, essentially to buy off a revolution. And this is, Asamoah and Robinson, I think, the most recent famous version of this, but there's a lot that came before. And you've criticized the empirics on that. But the model's familiar to us. And the idea, I think it's you guys drank it with your mother's milk during the Cold War. The idea that there's this kind of spooky communist threat out there that is backing a whole bunch of revolutions all around the world. And then the United States is in the counterinsurgency business, but it's about a kind of a left-wing insurgency that we're worried about. What you're describing is really different. What you're describing is more of a right-wing constituency that wants to threaten violence in order to lock in a status quo to prevent a shift. Right. And so it is a useful distinction between these two worlds. And I wonder how much of it, in my heart, I wonder how much of it is theatrical, because I definitely agree with you that it's not clear what policy concessions these people actually want.
And they're losing, and they will lose, right?
Exactly.
But that's not the only kind of violence. I mean, there's a way in which that violence hasn't been that extensive. But what has increased quite dramatically is this broad cluster of violence we associate with hate crimes. The one thing I did look up before sitting down here is I got on and looked at what the FBI said about hate crimes increasing from 2016 to 2017. Pretty significant jump in hate crimes. About half of those are motivated by race, ethnicity, but then there's a portion that's religion and gender, sexual orientation issues. Is that a source of decentralized violence that can escalate into a broader conflict, or does that simply stay at that decentralized level?
I would say it's an observable indicator of this deep unhappiness and the lines that are being drawn, right? The lines between, whites who previously had a privileged position and well, not, I mean,
a lot of it's imagined, right?
So I'm gonna go into a little bit of dystopia here. So there's been a selection effect happening in the United States over the last however many decades, where it used to be that most people were farmers, and you lived in your small town and you farmed, and it was a relatively egalitarian is the right word. And then people started moving, and mobility led to, people went to the cities, they started getting college educations, they started marrying other people they met in college, and they were more employable, and there was the drop in the manufacturing jobs, and there was this whole thing. And I think inequality is only going to increase. And I shouldn't even go there, because I'm just thinking, we all, because of genetic engineering, because of the technology we're going to have for wealthy people to even more select on traits and education and everything else that makes them more employable, and an economy that basically is going to demand, it's going to reward only a certain subset of the population. And this inequality is going, there's people who are going to lose, and they're going to lose a lot, and they're going to be angry, and
it doesn't, it's all speculative, but it sounds really plausible to me, right? I mean, to Steph's question, and I think we should stay on it because I think it's the right question, is whether the phenomenon of individual people with terrifying weapons that can obviously kill people 50 or 200 at a time, which we have a lot of evidence of this, and that's just going to continue. I don't see how that stops. Whether that actually ought to count as something like a civil war if all of them are united by the same kinds of grievances, even if they have no coherent ideology, right? It's a very different way of thinking about a civil war than I think we typically do when you and I go out and use the data sets that we use to make our inferences. What we're thinking about is actually pretty constrained. It's like, 1,000 people dead, 100 dead on the government side, but I want to know who, we're not talking about crime statistics here. I want to know who's the person who killed 100 people in the government, what's the social group, what do they represent, that kind of thing. And a whole bunch of different mass casualty terrorists do not aggregate up to a civil war by that coding rule. Yeah. But it still sucks.
I'm also,
sorry.
No, I'm also just curious if there's like some minimum threshold for public support that's necessary to, for us to imagine, for us to transition from just scattered incidents of domestic insurgency to civil war. I mean, is there any unifying synthesis to all this, given the fact that our political landscape is so fragmented?
I guess it depends on how the government responds. So let's say, you have, let's say an African-American woman wins in 2020, and that's our new president. And let's say she's also very progressive. And let's say that there's 1 or 2 seats on the Supreme Court that are suddenly open, and we have really, really progressive judges now placed on the Supreme Court. And suddenly you have flare-ups around the country. So you have Waco's times 15 or 20. It really does like, how does the government respond to that? Does it try to rein in some of the policies that triggered these outbreaks? So that would be the equivalent of concessions to these groups.
Or does it respond aggressively?
Does it respond aggressively? If it responds aggressively, you're sort of in a position, that it could escalate. And when it escalates, if they use violence, do you respond with violence? Does this then serve to radicalize another portion of the population? So it really, I wonder in that situation, how does the government respond to that sort of scenario?
Well, I just want to point out, I mean, we've kind of identified 3 different cleavages, right? Because Jesse brought up left-right, which is this whole, and you pushed that,
Race.
The whole question of economics, the United States has become dramatically less equal over the since about 1970. Then you have this extreme anti-government, kind of almost anarchic thing that's happening in the militia right. But then you've got race and ethnicity, which seems to me to be the place where a lot of violence is actually crystallizing in fact. I see the Bundys as more theater. I don't see the rise in hate crimes as theater. These are people getting killed. And the question is, to what extent that's backed by not these militias which are off training in Idaho, but groups that are exploiting social media, are moving to places like Charlottesville and exploiting opportunities like that to actually ramp up, social violence. Would you call that civil war?
I mean, right now it would be categorized. It would depend on how many people were killed as a result. But there's what's called large-scale armed conflict and small-scale armed conflict, and they both come under the umbrella of civil war is the way we currently define it.
Well, so the FBI statistics, because I did look at them, was one thing I looked at, 7,000 incidents in 2017. And a pretty wide sense that that's underreporting of hate crimes. Now, not all those resulted in death, but a lot of them were crimes, physical assaults on person, not just defacements and so forth. They included assaults, aggravated assaults, and so on. So that's one type of violence, which we do have evidence that seems to be going.
Well, at what point then would the government feel compelled the federal government feel compelled then to step in and introduce then that potential for escalation of civil conflict, as opposed to maybe a local government stepping in and the federal government, or the federal government waiting for these insurgencies to lose steam?
And the National Guard went in both Waco and in the Bundy case, correct? That was the National Guard that responded?
No, that's a good question. I think at some point
Waco was Waco.
That was the largest.
I believe was the FBI, but I'm not positive about that. I know Ruby Ridge. that's kind of near to my home. But I think you know, this question of whether, like, what level of government the response would be at is
it's an interesting
is an interesting.
Yeah, because it gets to the question of whether federalism actually provides a check on this kind of violence, because I can feel I'm governed in a way which is closer to what I prefer, rather than feeling like there's an imposition. I mean, after all, you've written on this. A lot of civil wars are secession. I mean, they have to do with wanting to break away. And I don't see that as being plausible, despite the discussions of, what is it called, Calexit? I don't think we're headed to. I don't think we're headed out of the
seven-state solution. My wife just wants to break up California. She's always talking about the seven-state solution. It's really just her desire to see all the electoral college votes splintered into 1,000 villages. It's not a real advocacy, but no, I'm a big fan of the kind of get to know your sheriff level of counterinsurgency, like that, and I think that is a lot of what ultimately did work in the Bundy case, was that they were surrounded, but everyone was hyper aware of the optics. Like everyone, had the Ruby Ridge in the back of their minds, and they did not want this to be, and so the the thing that social media changes about the world, it's really night and day between the Bundys and Ruby Ridge, is that everyone's live blogging it. There's you have both different media bubbles descend on the Bundy compound, and so it's not just the NPR story; it's also the Fox News story, and they were counting on that. But ultimately, they were just as humiliated by the watchers of Fox News as they were by the NPR and MSNBC crowd, and that's ultimately, again, I think that this was great moments in American civil society, is that we all laughed in the same way until these people realized that they had nothing to do except take the ammo out of their guns, and but that it were that easy with mass casualty shooters.
Or Charlotte.
No, sure, but the mass casualty people are the ones who actually keep me up at night. Like the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh. Like, what do you do with that guy? Except say, we need better predictive analytics. Using social media data, which also for civil liberties reasons makes me uncomfortable as an Idaho guy. I mean, I don't know. I don't think the solution to the lone wolf problem is easy or obvious, and I think we have essentially an epidemic of we could call it a civil war. Like we could call it a by the numbers civil war if we were to just do a column shift and say, well, if you're a certain kind of crazy, 1,000 dead, all you need is 100 dead on the government side. Now, I mean, I'll bet we get there in 5 or 6 years, but I mean, I hope we don't, but I don't know how to stop it. I don't think, though, I want to just say it again, I don't think that that's normally what we think of in our community when we talk about an insurgency. 10,000 lone wolves on 10,000 typewriters doth not an insurgency make. So.
You said something really smart a couple of years ago, and it stuck with me. And when we had this,
I know you're talking to Steph.
No, I'm talking to you, Jesse. So, and we were having this discussion about civil war, and you said, "Oh, it could never happen here." And you're just like, when it comes down to it, the state capacity of the U.S. is so great, and our bureaucracy is so deep and loyal and well organized that the state's just going to come down ultimately on anything that happens, and it will disappear. You said it better than that, but say a little bit more about that, because it's absolutely true. The U.S. is very strong.
Yeah, look, it's sure. We're doing social science here. What are the predictors of civil war? If it's reducible to one sentence, state weakness is the main predictor of civil war. And so then, the identification strategies for state weakness, whether you want to think about it as temporary state weakness in the civil, some break in the society as you're having a big polity shift, or if you want to think about it in the transition from independence, there's a whole bunch of different windows of opportunity that are created for a state to be temporarily weak, and then a whole bunch of distributional politics can happen, and sometimes that can go violent. But in equilibrium, if you're a strong state, people get arrested, and people fear being arrested, and people stay home. So when you said earlier that the United States controls the territory,
yeah.
I'm just giving a long-winded, high five.
Well, that was my starting point.
That's it. So it's mine too. Last night I taught in my counterterrorism class. We wrapped up with this book a couple years back from John Mueller and Mark Stewart. It's called Chasing Ghosts, and it basically is chronicling what they describe as overspending on the part of the American national security apparatus. But the point that they make is that we are all being tagged and tracked all the time, in multiple overlapping ways by the state. That's not even keeping track of the commercial infrastructure to track us all the time, which of course the state also has access to. So, I think that the evidence that I have, from the ways that the US government responded to potential insurgencies in the 1960s is that everybody ends up with their phone tapped. And, that doesn't help with the lone wolf problem exactly, but it certainly helps with the organized insurgency problem. It doesn't necessarily have very much to do with democracy or good governance, but I think we're all on the same page about that. So I think it would be very, very difficult to get an insurgency going unless you had an institutional base. It would have to be at the city level or maybe a state level, and I just don't see it. It's sanctuary cities or cheap talk, in this space.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Let me follow up, because this is,
and like just one more sentence, I think it is, we're all in agreement on this, but it would be good to be, absolutely clear. Comparisons to the 1860s, where you have a number of states of the Union willing to opt out and bring the institutions of their state with them, that's completely inappropriate, right? Like none of us think that that's a real thing. Okay, so.
Is there a scenario, though, in which there is this window of weakness here in the U.S.?
Yeah.
What could happen here in the U.S. that's plausible to put the U.S. in a period of instability?
I'll give you one, unless you have an idea. I don't want to talk over you. So I think the election of an African American left winger is in 2020. African American female left winger is less plausible than what I'm about to say. I got really frightened in a way that I don't think I've ever been before in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. And what frightened me, these are when there's a lot of really incompetent mistakes being made at the public relations side of the states, Sean Spicer and all of that. And I was genuinely worried about something related to North Korea, nuclear weapons, and a US military coup, where the military is like, I'm sorry. And the Joint Chiefs simultaneously stand up. And at that moment, you would have a genuine constitutional crisis of the sort we've never had in this country before. And all of the people that we're talking about would know which side they were on, right? So that's a split, right? Where you have the far right kids in the suburbs, who know that their guy has been removed by the deep state and that it's not a hypothetical conspiracy theory, and all of the libtards out there are backing the military. That's something that really scared me. And, we're out of the woods now, because I think that it's not as scary as it was, and I think that what I just articulated is super implausible today. But it didn't feel that implausible to me in the first 100 days. Because
is that because of Mattis?
I don't think that
is it really? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think or Kelly. No, but I don't think that there's any easy answer to this. I think that there was a time when a lot of the professionals were really nervous, and we're talking about nuclear risks here, so it wasn't crazy for the professionals to be really nervous. And like these kids in the suburbs, again, they knew whose side they were on in that. It would have immediately balkanized the country. Yeah. So
look, there was a serious discussion about command and control of nuclear weapons, and I think that was indicative of the fact that those kind of real concerns did exist. But let me try another scenario. What about a relatively strong state that condones violence? that effectively mobilizes violence or allows violence to go ahead of certain sorts.
Well, Trump is
Well, I'm
encouraging
asking,
that. Nick, do you want to get in here?
Yeah, no, but because I actually wanted to ask this earlier, is how can we expect the state to step in when we have someone say, I was to NPR, and they were interviewing this anonymous member of a white supremacist group, saying that our goal is to maximize violence, to maximize casualties of African Americans in the United States. And how does the government effectively step in, knowing that there are people like this scattered all throughout the United States, with no real effective way of targeting them other than, say, this deep state idea of listening in on people's phones, gathering enough evidence to suggest that they might be a security risk. How do we do that on the macro scale? Could that be considered the state condoning violence just by virtue of inaction?
Well, I think this raises an issue which again is closer to my vision of a dystopian Civil War future, which is not civil war as we would typically talk about in the Civil War literature, but something like this decentered violence. And I think the first thing that has to happen is a shift in the metric of what constitutes terrorism. There's been a tremendous reluctance to treat domestic perpetrators of violence, whether left or right, as terrorists. And that means the law enforcement's investment is skewed towards foreign terrorism as really what should be the focus, rather than other sources of domestic violence, which then go unchecked as a result of that. I think that's something that you could agree on factually, that local law enforcement and to some extent the national law enforcement has been slow in seeding domestic violence, including the hate crime cluster, as being effectively no different than terrorism. Yeah. That is, it's aimed at terrorizing and having the kinds of effects that Nick has talked about. So that's to me is a serious issue, is rethinking how we define things like terrorism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I do think we are entering into a new age, or a new style of, want to call it insurgency or civil war, and part of it is being fed by the internet. We know that a lot of the groups like the 3%ers that's how they're recruiting. It's really quite easy to do it that way, and it's hard to shut down. Anyway, it's time for questions.
We've been talking too long.
We've been talking a lot. We could talk forever, as you guys know who've had us in class.
Okay, here's one. There's about 2 questions on a similar topic. Doesn't a civil war versus civil unrest require a rallying issue? What would today's rally issue be?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Barb, you should answer.
Well, we know that most the relatively new militias that have been growing since 2008, their rallying cry is basically keep the government out of my life. They don't want government interference, and that could be everything from taxes to land rights to whole series of issues. So that seems to be what's galvanizing them. There's also undercurrents of racism, and that is part of that. Just like in the American Civil War, when they talked about states' rights, it was really about the right to own and sell slaves. And so there's elements of that. They don't want a government that is catering to an elite coastal constituency to dictate what they can do.
Look, I don't want to preempt questions, but this is such a good one. I'd like to just go another round on this. I think that most civil wars, the rallying cry is either secession or regime change. Yeah. You're either trying to get out or you're trying to change the central government. But isn't there a kind of social violence in which destabilization itself is a sort of intermediate goal, where there's an advantage seen in just creating an environment which is less secure, which is more uncertain?
That happens all the time.
Doesn't that
but
happen?
but it doesn't necessarily happen only in civil wars. I think
No,
that happens all the time.
But is it a path to wider?
Or maybe it's just weak. They want a weak federal government. They want a really weak federal government.
Let's get another question.
Okay. Do you believe there already exists an organized insurgency, but they are working within the legal system via voter suppression, judicial appointments, deregulation?
No, I don't think it's appropriate to talk about the Republican Party as an insurgency. I don't think that is a useful conversation to have. Next question.
Well, but it does raise a cognate question, which I think we'll have to put off to another podcast, which is just this whole question of whether the nature of political competition is eroding. And again, potentially on both sides is eroding democratic norms.
This is the question I was trying to articulate at the very beginning, is that I don't know if genuinely this is the worst it's ever been, or if this is exactly the same way that it's always been. I'm a student of history, but you only live one life, right? So I take the work of David Blight really seriously. This is a Yale historian who writes about the American Civil War, and he also writes about Reconstruction and talks a lot about Reconstruction. And when people tell me that America's never been this polarized, I just laugh. It's like it's just obviously American institutions were a little bit more polarized during Reconstruction, for instance. Okay, we're living through some hard times right now, and the internet is definitely having the effect of making everyone's personal news feel very personal, and bigger than maybe it is. But it cuts both ways, right? So one of the things so I've been working a lot on Ukraine recently. We have genuine state failure, genuine regime change, whatever you want to call it. There's a whole bunch of high-level politics that take place in a Facebook era. And one thing that happens, to your point, Barb, is that absolutely Facebook and social media is used to organize militias. It's just how you do it, right? And it's the community of us who have worked closely on Ukraine. We all wish that we had the foresight to do what Yuri Zhukov had the foresight to do immediately, which is just get on Facebook and code town by town using Facebook data who is militias are claiming which town. It's like the best data because it's just what you would use. So that's completely consistent with the kind of argument. You also see the spread of misinformation. You get the fascist narrative, the coup narrative. That goes on social media too. From both sides. Terrorists on one side, fascists on the other, and it goes crazy in the media space. However, the cutting both ways point is that you also have social media being able to fact check claims of atrocity. Okay, a little Ukrainian boy was crucified yesterday and it was on the news. Okay, hold on. Here's my phone. Like, show me, show me. And so for that reason, we're really confident, we social scientists are very, very confident that there's no missing data on missing bodies in Ukraine. Like, we know that about 10,000 people have died, and we know that, that's a tragedy. Every death is a tragedy. But, prior to social media, like when Milosevic was doing what he was doing to politicize these ethnic cleavages, if everyone had had cell phones, they could have fact-checked things a little bit faster. So that's a way that, the hyper-connectivity, there's pluses and there's minuses, right? And some of them may actually be de-escalating violence by allowing false claims of atrocity to be debunked.
Can we take another question? Yeah,
sure.
That's good.
What effect of undermining the media is key to global insecurity and insurrection?
What effect of undermining the media?
Let me take a stab at that. I mean, I think that one of the things that's coming out of the new media studies is that it's this cognitive polarization that's really so dangerous. It's not just that news is false. It's that people occupy worlds where their biases tend to be reinforced in very powerful ways. And so you're not subjected to the kind of cross-cutting sources of information that would moderate perspective. So I think the media problem, setting aside the question of direct electoral interference and so on, that the media problem is really connected to the polarization problem.
Yeah, and it goes down to algorithms, right? Algorithms are designed to just continuously feed us and reinforce what we're already thinking. And it has the effect of not, it's not neutral, right? It actually steers you towards the extreme.
Yeah.
So
We think.
So those
But
two,
it's also
yeah.
it's also new, right? I mean, like that's the
Right,
thing
right.
about this new
Also,
space
yeah.
is that
Right.
we're not in, we know an awful lot about how American institutions work. We actually know a lot about how voter suppression works. We know much less about how
this.
our minds work in
Yeah.
this new space with pixels.
But yeah, particularly given that we're talking to a GPS audience in part, I mean, there's a lot of new psychological work on this, in how we take pleasure in seeing things that we like to see. And I just saw a very interesting piece on Facebook, which talked about Facebook's struggles with these issues. And they put 5 people in front of the camera, and one of them said, we want people to have a good experience at Facebook. What does that mean if you're a terrorist? That you go to Facebook and you have a good experience because you see other people thinking like you do. Well, that's not necessarily socially optimal for people to have a good Facebook experience in that particular sense of having things reinforced. So that's an important question. I think there's going to be a lot more written on that.
Yeah.
Should we take another one?
The current political violence is predominantly from the left, Antifa in Portland and Berkeley, etc. Real current violence is from the intolerant left. Why assume the right will be the problem when current data shows it is the left that incubates violence?
I guess my response to that is I would like to view that evidence. And, is when you talk about violence, is it deaths? Is it attacks? Is it what constitutes that? Because the data that I have viewed, especially since 2008, indicates that it is a dramatic shift away from the left and to the right. The right is now more likely to be the perpetrators of both hate crime attacks, and I don't know if mass shootings. I'd have to look into that.
Most of those are not. I don't think this question should be ruled out. And I think there's a tendency to rule it out. But if polarization continues, then you would expect exactly that you would get responses. And that extremes love to play with extremes, because if the objective is a general kind of destabilization, then you could certainly expect that dynamic. And I think that whether the current levels of violence are associated with Antifa and so forth is sort of an empirical issue. But I think conceptually it's not implausible that that's the way that violence roils.
The one trend we have seen is we know that both the left and right have shifted towards the extremes. The right has shifted further to the extreme.
Based on what?
I'm trying to remember what that was.
The evidence for that claim.
Well, I mean, movements, for example, within the Republican Democratic parties with respect to measures of voting and things within the
measures, so voting measures. It's true that the furthest left Democrat and the furthest left Republican and the furthest right Democrat are now separate. That's been true for a while.
Right.
So,
but that's a long way.
A long way from what was just
violence.
Yeah.
That's really, we have to be careful there. I mean, polarization is not the same thing as violence.
Right.
It's just opens the door for
Right.
But to this person's point, I tried to kind of visualize insurgency along that spectrum, and I did put alt-right, white supremacists on the right, Antifa on the left. But I was hesitant to write down Antifa because I'm wondering, have there been any casualties reported as a result of violence by Antifa at rallies? Has there been any deaths, real life consequences as a result of leftist violence, or is that mostly an issue of
I think it's actually an empirical question that the questioner should ask.
Yeah. Should we take one more?
Mm-hmm. 2 more if we can.
Sure.
Sorry. Can you look into the geographical dimension for this new civil war? In the past, it was North versus South. Does it still hold true in the current political environment?
No, it's coast and center, both.
That's a great question, though. But the South is solid, right? The South is still solid.
The South has been solid since
and will be solid.
Yeah. But that's political polarization, right? I mean, I think you said it better before when you were doing your dystopia about. No, I'm serious about
the selection effects.
Yeah, the selection effects and what these people, in these communities are actually worried about, to the extent that we want to give them given the time of day, it's that the trends of inequality do benefit tiny strips of our society, and they're not randomly selected. You know, they're not spread all around the country.
And it's become urban-rural, really. That's what it's become, urban-rural. And urban is really a proxy just for a whole host of things, like education and more high-paying jobs and a whole series of things. So the South is predominantly rural, with islands of deep blue, and those islands of deep blue are all urban centers.
But the perception by people, I mean, this is why I jumped on the distinction between urban and suburban before, is that you've got these people living in the suburbs who don't see a clear life path out of the worst parts of the service industry. And that's what they see, you know, is that they are capped in their upward mobility, and they can see that absolutely clearly at age 26. And that makes them very susceptible to narratives where they're being repressed by people, by globalization, right? By all of these sort of, like, whatever you want to call the other trends, you know, and that you can weaponize that. It doesn't take much.
Yeah.
Let's take the last one.
Right. Let's end on a happy note. How can each of us work to reduce polarization and room for violence in the U.S.? What can individuals and communities do to combat increasing polarization?
Boy, that's a really good question. I think, frankly, that's incumbent on institutions dominated by liberals.
I was waiting for you to say this. This is important.
Where are the Republicans? Where are in our academic ivory towers? You know, it's a problem. I mean, I think that academic institutions need to look inward and think about diversity in a very different way. I mean, we thought about it in terms of diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. Have we thought about it in terms of class? Have we thought about it in terms of region? Have we thought about populations that are not the ones that we typically reach out to? I think we've got to do some work.
Okay. Anyway, thank you everybody for
sticking with us.
Sticking with us, listening to us. Thank you, all of you, for doing this.
Fun.
I could never have done it alone, and it was really interesting and fun.
Thanks, Bob.